Please don't call the police.
Here, please take this. It's warm. Excuse me, you dropped this.
At 2:17 on a freezing Thursday morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Grace Whitmore heard something that made her heart stop, a faint cough coming from inside her locked garage. She stood at the top of the stairs, gripping her robe, listening as another sound followed, the slow scrape of someone shifting across the concrete floor. Grace lived alone. She had checked the doors twice before going to bed. There was no reason anyone should have been inside. Yet when she finally opened the garage door, she found a stranger curled beneath an old moving blanket beside her workbench, his face pale with exhaustion and his hands wrapped tightly around a worn leather bag. She had no idea that the man sleeping 6 feet from her lawn mower was about to change the way she understood forgiveness, loss, and second chances forever. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can reach people when nothing else can, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories about compassion, faith, forgiveness, and the unexpected second chances that can change a life. Grace was 41 and had spent most of her adult life learning how to survive disappointment without allowing it to make her bitter. 3 years earlier, she had lost her husband, Nathan, after a long illness, and the quiet house he left behind sometimes felt larger than the world itself. Nathan had been the kind of man who never drove past someone with a flat tire without stopping, and Grace often remembered how he used to say that people rarely needed judgment as much as they needed someone willing to stay. After his death, she kept herself busy managing a small flower shop downtown, tending the garden Nathan had planted, and volunteering twice a month at a local food pantry. She was not wealthy, and there were days when she counted every dollar before paying a bill, but she had learned that having little did not mean having nothing to give. That night, however, kindness had to fight its way through fear. Grace quietly stepped into the garage and switched on the overhead light. The stranger immediately woke. He was perhaps 50 years old, with gray beginning to show at his temples and a face marked by exhaustion rather than age. He raised his hands slowly, making it clear he did not want trouble. Grace reached for her phone, but something in his expression stopped her. He looked less like a dangerous intruder and more like a man who had run out of places to go. His jacket was soaked from the freezing rain, his shoes were covered in mud, and his lips trembled as he tried to explain that he had nowhere else to sleep. He had not stolen anything. He had slipped through the partially damaged side door after seeing the garage was empty and had fallen asleep almost immediately. Grace should have called the police. Every reasonable instinct told her that. Instead, she remembered Nathan's words. She asked the stranger his name, and after a long silence he finally answered, saying his name was Caleb Mercer. He apologized repeatedly and promised to leave before sunrise. Grace studied him carefully before telling him he could stay until morning, but only if he remained in the garage and did not touch anything. She brought him a bowl of soup, a bottle of water, and an old blanket Nathan had used during winter road trips. Caleb accepted them with both hands as though Grace had handed him something priceless. The next morning, Grace expected him to disappear. Instead, she found him standing beside her broken garden gate, repairing a loose hinge with a screwdriver he had found on the workbench. He explained that fixing things helped him think. Grace noticed that his hands were rough but unusually careful. He repaired the hinge perfectly, then asked if he could help with anything else before leaving. She offered him breakfast, and while they ate at opposite ends of the kitchen table, Caleb revealed only fragments of his life. He had once owned a construction company in another state. His business had collapsed after a chain of financial mistakes and a painful partnership dispute. His marriage had ended soon afterward, and he had spent years trying to rebuild a life he no longer recognized. Recently, after his last temporary job disappeared, he had begun traveling from place to place, sleeping wherever someone allowed him to stay. Grace did not ask for details. She knew what it meant to have a life suddenly divided into before and after. Over the next several days, Caleb helped at the flower shop in exchange for meals and a safe place to sleep in the garage. He repaired broken shelves, fixed a leaking sink, and even built wooden display stands for Grace's spring flowers. Customers began noticing the difference. One elderly customer named Martha said the shop felt warmer somehow. Grace smiled but said nothing. Caleb rarely spoke about himself, yet every time someone needed help, he was the first to step forward. When a delivery truck got stuck outside, he pushed it free. When an elderly customer dropped her groceries, he carried them to her car. His actions seemed to reveal a person completely different from the defeated man Grace had found sleeping beneath a blanket. Then, one afternoon, a polished black SUV stopped outside the shop. A sharply dressed man stepped out and entered the store carrying a thin folder. His name was Jonathan Reeves, a lawyer from Chicago. Grace recognized the uncertainty on his face immediately. He asked if she knew a man named Caleb Mercer. Grace glanced toward the back room, where Caleb was repairing a wooden shelf. When Caleb heard his name, he appeared in the doorway and froze. Jonathan explained that he had spent nearly 2 years searching for Caleb on behalf of a family foundation. Grace was confused until Jonathan opened the folder and showed her an old photograph. It was Caleb, years younger, standing beside a large construction site. The man in the photograph looked confident, successful, and completely different from the stranger she had found in her garage. Jonathan revealed that Caleb had once built one of the largest privately owned construction companies in his region. But the surprising part was not his wealth. Before his company collapsed, Caleb had quietly created a charitable foundation worth millions of dollars. He had instructed his attorneys that if he ever disappeared from public life, the foundation should continue supporting struggling families, veterans, food banks, and small community organizations. Grace looked toward Caleb, stunned. The man sleeping in her garage had once been wealthy beyond anything she could imagine. But Caleb shook his head when Jonathan told him the foundation was still waiting for him. He said he had walked away because he believed he had failed everyone. He had lost his company, his marriage, his confidence, and eventually his sense of purpose. He had been too ashamed to return to the people who once trusted him. He thought disappearing was easier than admitting he was broken. Grace finally understood why the leather bag never left his side. Inside it were letters from people the foundation had helped years earlier. Caleb had kept them because they were the only evidence he possessed that his life had once mattered. Grace did not tell him that she thought he was foolish. Instead, she told him something simple: a person who has made mistakes is not the same thing as a person who is a mistake. Caleb stared at her for several seconds, and for the first time since she had met him, tears filled his eyes. Jonathan offered Caleb the chance to return and rebuild the foundation, but Caleb was afraid. Grace reminded him that rebuilding did not mean pretending the past had never happened. It meant using what he had learned to help someone else avoid the same loneliness. Weeks passed. Caleb accepted the offer. He did not return to his old mansion or buy another luxury car. Instead, he rented a modest office and began working with community organizations across Iowa. He helped create a program that provided temporary housing and job training for people who had lost everything. Grace became one of the program's local partners, and the flower shop eventually became a place where people could find not only flowers but information about food assistance, employment opportunities, and community resources. Months later, Grace stood outside her garage on a warm spring morning. The old blanket where Caleb had once slept was folded neatly on a shelf. She almost threw it away several times, but she never could. Caleb came by that morning carrying a small wooden box. Inside was a brass key and a handwritten note thanking Grace for opening her garage door on the night when he believed his life was over. He told her that the key was symbolic. It represented the door she had opened when she had every reason to close it. Grace smiled through tears and told him the door had never really been hers to open. Nathan had taught her that kindness was something we borrowed from one another and passed along. Caleb looked toward the garden, where new flowers were beginning to bloom, and quietly said that perhaps he finally understood. Sometimes the person standing at our door is not there to take something from us. Sometimes they are there because life has brought them to the one place where they can finally begin again. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes people deserve another chance, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story of hope and kindness. And before we reach the ending, I want to ask you something special. Leave a comment saying, "Everyone deserves a second chance," if you believe one act of compassion can change the direction of an entire life. Grace never forgot the night she found Caleb sleeping in her garage. What began with fear became friendship, what looked like an intrusion became an unexpected blessing, and what seemed like the end of one man's life became the beginning of something far greater. Caleb had once measured his worth by buildings, money, and success. Grace helped him discover that a person's greatest value is not what they own, but what they are willing to give when someone else has nothing left. And every time Grace opened that garage door afterward, she remembered the stranger she had found sleeping in the darkness. He had entered looking for a place to hide. He left having found a reason to live again.